I wasn't supposed to find this. The basement of the Fairmont Library was not on any floor plan. The stairwell had been boarded over, swallowed by decades of plaster and paint, but the workers restoring the foundation accidentally split it open. I followed them down, drawn by the smell first, a sour, metallic damp that clung to my tongue like rusted coins. Each step groaned under my weight, and the air grew thicker, humid with the kind of rot that settles in a place where no light has reached for over a century. At the bottom, I found a room that should not exist. No shelves, no catalogued archives, just a concrete chamber lined with file cabinets, their iron drawers swollen from moisture. Mold crept in green constellations across the walls, and water dripped steadily from the ceiling, each drop echoing with unnatural clarity. I used my phone's light to sweep the room, and that's when I saw it, a single ledger on a desk in the middle of the floor. Not locked away like the rest, displayed, as if meant to be found. The leather binding cracked when I opened it. The first pages were dated 1878. The ink had bled in places, words blurred by time, but enough remained legible to make my stomach tighten. It wasn't an account book, not exactly, it read more like a roster. Names, ages, and beside each entry, a column of numbers. Some were struck through, others circled, and a few were blotted out completely with heavy strokes of ink, as if someone had wanted to erase them from existence. The name that repeated most often was Fairmont. At first, I thought it was simply a family register. Large Mormon families were not uncommon in Utah at the time. But then I noticed the other pattern. Beside each Fairmont name was the same number. 7, scrawled over and over again, as if burned into the paper. Not a date, not a count, just the number. When I flipped deeper into the ledger, the entries became stranger. Children listed with no parents. Parents listed twice, once under Public Record and again under Private Archive. Some pages were missing entirely, torn out with a violence that left ragged wounds in the binding. Others had been blackened with thick tar-like ink, leaving behind only faint indentations of words pressed hard into the parchment. I tried tracing the marks with my fingers, feeling the grooves of phrases too obscured to read, except for one, pressed deep enough that it had scarred the paper beneath. Doctrine must remain hollow. I snapped the ledger shut and immediately wished I hadn't opened it at all. There was something about the air in that basement, it felt different now, heavier, charged with an intent I couldn't name. My breath quickened, and I kept glancing over my shoulder, expecting to find someone standing there in the shadows. The silence was not silent anymore, it carried the weight of whispers too faint to hear but too near to ignore. I should have left it there. Locked the door. Pretended I had never seen it. But my eyes caught one final thing before I could convince myself to leave, a slip of paper tucked into the back cover, newer than the rest. Typed, not written. If you are reading this, the Fairmonts are still among us. The fluorescent light overhead flickered once, and in that instant of darkness, I knew I was no longer dealing with forgotten history. This wasn't just a ledger, it was a trigger. And I had already pulled it. I left the basement carrying the book in my hands, though I can't tell you why. Maybe because I knew if I didn't, someone else would. Maybe because whatever the hollow doctrine was, it had been buried for a reason. And I needed to know why. The deeper I went into the ledger, the less it read like a family record and more like an administrative file. Each name, each number, was connected to something larger, an institution. The pages referred repeatedly to a place called the Sterling Institute of Moral Sciences. It sounded respectable enough, the kind of school you'd expect in late 19th century Utah. According to a small mention I found in a brittle 1880 issue of the Salt Lake Tribune, it was established in the high desert outskirts of Provo. Officially, it was described as a charitable endeavor, a boarding school for disadvantaged children and orphans of the frontier. A Christian-Mormon hybrid project, blending scripture and science, overseen by a Reverend Dr. Elias Sterling. I wanted to believe it was just another forgotten orphanage. But the details didn't align. Government reports from the period show no record of children leaving the Sterling Institute, no graduates, no transfers, no marriages filed under their names. They entered the school, and then, disappeared. The census data from 1870 to 1890 confirms it. Hundreds of children are listed as admitted, yet not one can be traced in adulthood. They were swallowed whole, as though the building itself had digested them. The more I read, the more Reverend Elias Sterling unsettled me. His sermons, archived in the Church History Library in Salt Lake City, carry a peculiar language. He spoke often of purity of stock, of refining generations into their perfected form. His words were cloaked in scripture but leaned disturbingly toward eugenics, decades before that word would exist. He believed the Fairmont line in particular was chosen, though compromised by contamination. One document, a fundraising letter addressed to Utah's territorial governor in 1878, dripped with righteous intent. The Lord has burdened my heart with the mission to uplift and correct those who would otherwise falter. The Fairmont progeny, though many, carry traits unsuited to the holy destiny of our people. By excising and reshaping, by cultivating new flesh through ordered doctrine, we prepare a generation unbroken, a vessel unmarred. Excising. Reshaping. New flesh. The ledger I had carried from the basement suddenly took on a sharper focus. Those circled sevens, the erased names, the blacked-out pages, they were not random. They were the record of a program. I dug further and found a surviving photograph of the Institute's facade. A large stone building, squared like a fortress, with a cross carved above the doorway. Children stand in front in orderly rows, their faces vacant. Not smiling, not waving, just staring forward, their eyes unnaturally alike. The school was said to have been self-sufficient. Farms, workshops, dormitories. But no photographs exist of the interiors. No floor plans survive. And according to the Utah Historical Society, the building itself was razed in 1904, under structural duress. But here's what disturbs me most, tucked into the back of the Tribune article, a single quote from Reverend Sterling during the Institute's consecration. Our doctrine is hollow so that the Lord may fill it. And when the vessel is prepared, it shall never die. That word again. Hollow. Children who never left. Records that vanish into black ink. A founder whose rhetoric blends piety with surgical cruelty. The Sterling Institute presented itself as salvation for the unwanted. But everything I've read suggests it was something else entirely, a system designed not to raise children, but to erase and replace them. And somehow, the Fairmonts were at the center of it. The first testimony I uncovered wasn't in any official archive. It came from a box misfiled in the Utah State Records Office, under Agricultural Reports, 1882. Inside, among papers on crop yields and irrigation, was a small stack of handwritten letters. They all bore the same header, the Sterling Institute of Moral Sciences. At first glance, they appeared routine, children writing to sponsors or relatives, thanking them for donations of clothing or books. But the handwriting caught me. Every letter, whether from a 12-year-old boy or a 17-year-old girl, was written in the same looping script. Identical phrasing, identical greetings, identical sign-offs. I am well and improving. My studies are fruitful. I pray for you as you pray for me. Line after line, repeated across years. The names at the bottom were different, but even they seemed too neat, too practiced, as though added at the last moment by another hand. When I compared them to census records, something horrifying emerged. Those children's names didn't exist anywhere else. No birth certificates, no marriage licenses, no graves. It was as though the only proof of their existence was locked inside those letters, and even that proof felt manufactured. But one letter broke the pattern. Hidden among the duplicates was a page scrawled in shaking, uneven lines, as though the writer had fought for every word. I cannot remember my mother's face. They tell me my name is Henry Fairmont, but when I say it aloud, it does not sound true. The others are forgetting too. Some smile when they forget, some weep until they cannot stand. We are made to write these words, over and over, until they no longer belong to us. I beg you, if this letter reaches outside these walls, know that I was someone else. My true name is carved into the dormitory stone, 3rd row, 6th from the bottom. Please, remember me. I searched photographs of the Institute's ruins, taken just before its demolition. On one crumbling wall, faint under lichen and weathering, were dozens of carvings, names etched by desperate hands. Yet nearly every one had been scratched out, gouged over with deep grooves until only scars remained. There was also a photograph of the children, rows of them in plain smocks. At first, I thought it was the same picture I'd already seen, but then I noticed, the dates were years apart. The children looked older, but their expressions had not changed. Their faces were unervingly similar, their eyes dulled into the same hollow stare. It was as though individuality had been stripped from them, and only the shell of a student remained. The ledger I carried from the Fairmont basement began to make more sense. Entire pages with names blacked out. Children listed, then erased. Perhaps not dead, not buried, but emptied. And then, another voice emerged. In the archives of the Salt Lake City courthouse, I discovered a sworn deposition from 1885. The witness, Margaret Hale, a nurse who had once worked at the Institute. Her statement was brief, but every word carried dread. They are not taught as other children are taught. Their prayers are repeated until meaning fades. Their birthdays are not celebrated, instead, the day is struck from record. After months, they do not know how old they are. The Reverend says memory is a burden we must relieve them of. I could not bear it. I left before I too forgot who I was. A system that erased identity, not just by destroying records, but by hollowing out the mind itself. Henry Fairmont, if that was truly his name, had begged someone to remember him. But all I had left were scratched-out stones, identical letters, and portraits of children who no longer looked alive. The Sterling Institute had perfected the art of disappearance, not by killing its subjects, but by erasing them so thoroughly they no longer belonged to themselves. And I couldn't shake the feeling that the same method was still at work, waiting for new names to be written and erased. The Sterling Institute was demolished more than a century ago, yet its absence feels deliberate, as if someone wanted the earth itself to forget. Still, in the course of my research, I came across a series of photographs taken in 1903, just a year before the demolition. They were tucked into the estate papers of a city surveyor named Hiram Pike, who had been hired to assess the building's structural duress. The photographs are difficult to describe. At first, they show what you'd expect: collapsed ceilings, cracked stone, mildew crawling up plaster walls. But then I noticed the inconsistencies. One photo depicts a stairwell that loops back into itself, a spiral of rotting wood and stone, photographed from several angles, each time revealing the same landing no matter where Pike stood. In another, a hallway lined with doors, yet every door bears the same number carved into its surface, room 7. The final photograph is the most unsettling. It shows what appears to be an elevator shaft, though the Institute had no electricity. The cage is made of wrought iron, descending into pure darkness. Beside the shaft, scratched into the stone wall, are words in a child's hand: "We keep going down but never arrive." I should have dismissed them as damaged photos or tricks of exposure. But Pike's notes, preserved in pencil scrawl, tell a darker story. The foundations do not correspond with the plans provided. Walls shift. Doors appear where none stood the day before. Several times I have walked in circles only to find myself below ground without knowing how I descended. I hear water running behind the walls, yet no pipes exist. Last night I saw a candle still burning in a room we had cleared of debris. I extinguished it, and when I turned back, it burned again. The silence here carries voices. The journals also mention treatment rooms. These were hidden in the sub-basements, windowless cells lined with padded walls. Pike found remnants of what he called ritual sedation. Bottles of laudanum. Straps attached to wooden chairs. Soundproof doors that sealed from the outside. There were sketches, too. Crude, hand-drawn diagrams of children sitting blindfolded, ears plugged, mouths covered by heavy cloths. Above them, in Sterling's handwriting, "When all senses are closed, the vessel is open." I couldn't shake the image of those children, isolated in darkness, stripped of every tether to the world until even their memories dissolved. Sensory deprivation not as punishment, but as ritual, a way of hollowing them out. And then there was Pike's final entry, written in a shaky hand that trailed off into blots: "The lower chamber is not stone. It bleeds when struck." My hammer left a wound that closed again as I watched. There are passages here that are not meant for men. I feel the doctrine living in the walls. I will not go back. The phrase, "the doctrine living in the walls," has haunted me ever since. It is tempting to think Pike lost his mind, corrupted by mold spores or isolation. Yet one of his photographs, the elevator shaft, shows something my eyes cannot explain. If you look closely at the iron cage, the reflections do not align. The shaft walls curve one way, but the reflection in the bars bends another. A faint human silhouette is visible, standing in the reflection, though the shaft is otherwise empty. For years, the institute was dismissed as a failed orphanage, demolished for safety. But beneath it all lay chambers no blueprint can account for, rituals no church can justify, and a structure that seemed to shift and breathe with its own terrible will. The Fairmont name, written again and again in the ledger, begins to feel less like genealogy and more like an address, a destination inside that cursed architecture. Somewhere deep in the foundation, the hollow doctrine still waits. I had convinced myself that the Sterling Institute was a singular aberration, a grotesque experiment buried in the Utah desert. But the ledger refused to agree with me. In its later pages, the entries spread outward. Names were no longer tied solely to Provo. Scribbled in the margins were unfamiliar town names: Carson City, Helena, Flagstaff, even as far as Chicago. At first, I assumed these were transfer points for Fairmont relatives or distant cousins. But then I noticed the symbols. Each location bore the same mark, inked beside the name, a narrow oval, hollow in the center, with 3 lines radiating downward like roots. Always drawn by the same hand. Always in the same black ink. I thought little of it until I found a registry misfiled in the University of Utah's Special Collections. It was a ledger from an institution called the Hale Academy for Moral Improvement, dated 1886. Different handwriting, different stationery, but on the front cover, the same symbol. The hollow oval. The entries were nearly identical to those of the Sterling Institute: children listed, numbers repeating, names struck through. Several were circled with the number 7. One, disturbingly, bore the name Fairmont again. This was no isolated institution. It was a network. The Hale Academy had been in Montana. Another ledger, from an asylum outside St. Louis, used the same record-keeping structure. And still another, from a school in Colorado Springs. Each time, the buildings were eventually condemned and razed. Yet the paper trail suggests they had all been part of the same design, a web of moral science projects scattered across the country, moving children like pawns from one site to another. The names of the founders varied: Reverend Elias Sterling, Dr. Hiram Black, Sister Catherine Vale, but their words, preserved in letters and appeals, carried the same refrain: the doctrine is hollow, so that it may be filled. And then, another phrase that I had not yet seen: we are the daughters of silence, the keepers of vessels. The more I read, the colder I felt. The daughters were not a convent, though their language mimicked one. They seemed to be a network of patrons, mostly women of wealth and standing, who lent legitimacy to these institutions. Their names appear in donor records, in property transfers, even on official state documents. Politicians married into their ranks. Judges ruled in their favor. The silence they cultivated was not only spiritual, it was bureaucratic. I wish I could say I remained detached, but the truth hit closer than I expected. Buried in the Hale Academy records was a transfer sheet dated 1889. On it, the name, Fairmont, appeared again, beside another I recognized immediately. My great-grandmother's maiden name. I stared at it for minutes, the letters blurring. She had never spoken of her childhood, only that she was sent away, before eventually making her way back to Utah. Could she have been one of them? A child of the Hollow Doctrine? A survivor, or a vessel? If so, then my family was not outside of this system. It had been shaped by it. Which meant my own existence was part of the same ledger I had been following. The network of institutions had rotted into the bones of the country. Schools, asylums, orphanages, all presenting themselves as noble while erasing the lives inside them. The Sterling Institute was only one root of a much larger tree, its branches stretching across decades and states. And at the center of that tree, watching silently, were the Daughters of Silence, keepers of the Hollow Doctrine, ensuring that no vessel ever stayed empty for long. I thought research would shield me. That the Hollow Doctrine was history, a past unearthed but safely distant. I was wrong. The deeper I pressed, the more present it became. The ledger had carried me from Utah to Montana, from Missouri to Colorado. Each place whispered the same refrain. But it was not until I returned to Provo, to the ruins of the Sterling Institute itself, that the doctrine finally confronted me. The basement had been sealed since 1904, the demolition crew collapsing the substructures and filling them with rubble. But a storm 2 weeks ago eroded part of the hillside, exposing what lay beneath. I entered through a jagged breach in the earth. The air inside carried that same metallic damp I remembered from the Fairmont Library, rust, mold, and something sharper, like old blood. At the center of the chamber stood a chair. Straps hung limp from its arms. A child's smock lay folded neatly on its seat, as though waiting for someone. And beside it, a phonograph. I don't know why I wound the crank, only that my hands moved without my consent. The needle dropped, and a voice filled the chamber. Not Sterling's, but a child's, thin, wavering. My name was, the recording stuttered. They tell me I am Anna Fairmont. I try to write it but the letters vanish. Please, if you hear me, remember me. If I do not leave this place, will it matter that I was here? The phonograph whined and fell silent. I wanted to run. Instead, I found myself answering aloud, my voice cracking in the damp air, yes. It matters. And then I heard breathing. Not my own. In the shadows beyond the chair, a figure stood, a girl no older than 12, her face pale as paper, her eyes wide and hollow. She did not move toward me, but her lips parted. The words came out cracked and desperate, will it matter if I get out? I froze. I wanted to promise her everything, to tell her the truth would save her, that I could carry her name into the world. But the ledger in my pack felt impossibly heavy, every erased line pressing against my ribs. To expose it meant condemning families, unraveling lineages, turning living descendants into relics of a system they never chose. If I buried it, the doctrine might finally remain forgotten. Survivors, if any remained, could live in peace. But Anna Fairmont would be erased again, her voice smothered by silence. My throat burned. My hands shook. And then I realized there was no safe choice. Only cost. I placed the ledger on the chair. The child's smock stared back at me like a second skin. For a long moment I stood there, the matches in my pocket cutting into my palm. When I struck the flame, it hissed in the damp. I set it to the ledger, the ink bubbling, the pages curling. The fire climbed fast, consuming the records, the numbers, the names. Anna's name. My great-grandmother's name. All of them. The girl's face flickered in the firelight. For a second, I thought she smiled. Then the chamber filled with smoke, and she was gone. I left the ruins with nothing but the smell of char in my clothes. On the way out, I saw a single candle sitting in a niche of the wall. I reached to snuff it out, but stopped. Instead, I left it burning. A hollow flame, still alive, waiting for someone else to find it. The official report filed 2 weeks later was short, almost insultingly so. An accidental fire, caused by unstable foundations and exposed methane pockets, consumed the last remaining structure of the Sterling Institute. Site condemned. No records of significance recovered. That was it. A century of silence, preserved in a paragraph. The fire I had started, clumsy, deliberate, had been repurposed into bureaucratic language. What I destroyed, they erased. In the days that followed, I scoured the debris field. Ashes lay thick across the stones, damp from rain, streaked with gray rivulets that smelled faintly of iron. I told myself I was searching for evidence that the children had been real: bones, buttons, scraps of cloth. But even those small fragments seemed curated, misplaced, or mislabeled. The county archive filed them under animal remains. The human traces were folded into paperwork until they no longer existed. One item did survive, though. It was wedged between 2 stones in the lowest chamber, where the fire had not quite reached. A small sketchbook, the cover blackened but intact. Inside were pages of crude drawings, children in rows, their eyes scratched out. A smock drawn again and again, its folds stiff and unnatural. And one page, softer, almost tender, a locket, opened, with 2 initials etched inside, A.F. Anna Fairmont. Her voice on the phonograph still echoes in me. If I do not leave this place, will it matter that I was here? I carry the sketchbook with me now. Not as proof, no court or archive would accept it, but as weight. As reminder. When I run my hand over its cover, ash clings to my fingertips, and I know it is not done. The hollow doctrine was never about one building, or one family. It was a pattern of silence, replicated across institutions, buried under respectability. A rot that seeps through generations, passed on like inheritance. And I wonder if in burning the ledger, I did exactly as they intended, preserved the silence. The public will believe the Institute collapsed, just as they believed the Hale Academy was condemned, the St. Louis Asylum shut for lack of funds. History will misfile the bones, rename the dead, forget the children who carved their names into stone only to scratch them out again. But the locket remains. The sketchbook remains. The candle I left burning in the wall remains. Sometimes, when I close my eyes, I see that candle still lit, flickering against wet stone, waiting. I tell myself I should have snuffed it out. But I didn't. I left it alive. And maybe that is the cruelest part: the hollow doctrine doesn't end. It only waits for someone to look too closely, to breathe in that damp, rusted air, to follow a ledger they were never meant to find. I wasn't supposed to find this. And now that I have, it will never let me go. 1.